Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Minister. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of the early insights developed with some of you in the room. And maybe a simple way of thinking about this is say, well, if clusters are the answer, what exactly is the question? Right? So let me share with you a little bit of what the question could be. And let's start with thinking 10 years ahead, right? Even more than 2 terms of government. And say, if in, say, 2026, you want to have a continued prosperous WA, and prosperous not just in economic terms, but also in terms of a growing population that has a meaningful way of life, which includes having meaningful jobs. If you want to have the wealth to basically buy and pay for services that we all aspire to have, and the infrastructure that goes with it, if that's the vision that you have, and that's certainly a vision that we would subscribe to, there's a few things that you need to get right. And some of them will be tricky, and some of them will be even trickier. So there's a bit of circularity in these things, but let's just take the existing projections that the various agencies like the Australian Bureau of Statistics and some of the WA agencies have made as a starting point. So first, labor supplies continue to grow quite significantly with more than 400,000 people. So again, if you want to have a healthy participation rate, that means that you would need to create 400,000 jobs. And that's about the same as WA did in the last 20 years, right? So you need roughly the same amount of jobs in the next 10 years as WA has created in the last 20. And I'll share with you later a little bit more details. And about half of that is kind of, you can see where they come from. The other half isn't that obvious. Then, of course, somebody else said the world isn't standing still, right? And we all know that automation, robotics is coming. Now, as a firm, McKinsey doesn't believe that on a global scale that's going to lead to large-scale job losses, but it does mean that things are going to change. Every job, to some extent, will be exposed to automation. In the old days, you wrote a letter, now you wrote an email. That's also automation. And those kind of things will continue to do. So every job, some more than others, will be impacted. But overall, it will create a significant shift. Some of what the old powerhouses, like mining and oil and gas, and certainly the construction bit of that, has been phenomenally beneficial to WA. It's hard to see the same amount of jobs and growth coming from those 2 sectors in the next 10 years, right? So in a way, what brought us here won't necessarily get us there. And then job quality. It was briefly mentioned by the previous speaker. You have kind of tradable jobs and non-tradable jobs. I'm not an economist, and a few of you are, so I'm probably going to represent it in a too simplistic way. But roughly speaking, tradable jobs tend to be higher paid and create the wealth, which you can then use to buy the services in the non-tradable jobs. And if I messed it up, then correct me in the Q&A. And I would say the starting point, i.e. the clusters, the current clusters that we have found, and we've only kind of scratched the surface, but it tells a tricky story. So on each of these points, let me give you a bit more detail. And for those of you in the back, apologies, you probably won't be able to read the numbers. But what it says is that the projection for WA population is that it grows to 3.3 million in 10 years. And if you say, okay, if 3.3 million people live in WA, how many jobs do I need? And that, of course, depends on what your participation rate objective is. But if you have a 70+% participation rate, which is generally seen as a healthy, the math is fairly simple. Then you need 1.75 million jobs, which is about 400,000 more than you need now. As I said, there's a bit of circularity in here because the 400,000 people the population growth, which is more than 400,000 even, they are partly attracted because there are jobs, right? So if there's no jobs, fewer people will come to WA. I'm Dutch, by the way, so I came here because there were wonderful opportunities. So there's a bit of a self-correcting mechanism in here, but still, 400,000 is a big number. And as you can see, it's the same number as we did in the last 20 years. Of those 400,000 jobs, and again, so you probably can't read all the numbers in the back, but at the bottom you got the 1.75 million jobs that we need in total. The first blue bit is about 250,000 jobs. That's kind of jobs which you can extrapolate from the current where we are, right? So in other words, for about 250,000 jobs, you can kind of expect where they come from because there's certain things already happening. You extrapolate that, For example, the population growth, we'll have more kids, you're going to need more primary school teachers. So it's just kind of predictable where those jobs come from. But that leaves a gap of about 200,000 jobs. So for those remaining 200,000 jobs, it is not immediately obvious of where would they come from. And this is on a WA basis. If you then say, well, obviously WA is a fairly heterogeneous state, right? There's a big metropolitan area, and then in terms of landmass, of course, a much, much bigger regional area. So there's various ways in which the statistical bureaus cut up WA. This is one where it's cut up in six bits. So there's a greater Perth area, and we've just put in 4 other regions here. And it's the same waterfall. So basically, we're asking ourselves, those 200,000 jobs or those 400,000 jobs, are they equally distributed? And basically what this picture shows is that in every single of the region of WA, a similar challenge exists. It's sometimes a little bit bigger, sometimes a little bit less. And surprisingly, if you take these figures as a basis, Mandurah is the place where the biggest gap is, primarily because of a lot of population growth in Mandurah. And of course, you ask yourself, why is there so much population growth in Mandurah projected? And to be honest, we don't quite know the answer. That's what the WA Bureau of Labor has predicted. So there's a lot of questions beneath this. But again, the message here is that on a state level, we're going to need more jobs, and not immediately obvious where they come from. And the same challenge repeats itself in the regions. And if you go to one level lower, which again is a bit difficult because the data is generally collected in a different way, but it's pretty much you see the same everywhere, right? It's in every region in WA, you have a similar challenge. Okay, that is basically the world as we know it. But as we also know, automation and robots and all those kind of things are coming. And I'm going to show you a very colorful slide, again with numbers that are very small, but I'll try to give you the gist of it. So basically, the way that McKinsey looked at it, and there's a lot of research on this on the web, and if you're interested, I'm happy to give you more, and it's on our website. There's hundreds of pages of research reports. But the point is as follows. Jobs don't get automated, tasks get automated. Right? And every job is a collection of tasks. And some tasks by nature are easier to automate. For example, predictable physical tasks, assembly line is a great example, is easier to automate by a robot, for example, than an unpredictable non-physical task. Right? So a policeman, for example, or a nurse is faced with many different things throughout the entire day. It's going to be much more difficult, if at all possible, to automate that. And if you then, so what we've done is that we have said there's 7 kind of clusters. There's managing, there's expertise, there's interfacing, so working with people, unpredictable physical, data collection, processing data, and predictable physical. And you say, okay, if there's 7 types of activities that we do, then some jobs will have more of the one bit and some will have more of the other bit. So we've then done the math basically, and for hundreds and hundreds of job types, you've kind of allocated how much of a particular job is predictable versus unpredictable, is people-based versus process-based. And then for each of these, you can then say, well, to what extent is this technically possible to automate? And if you then add it all up again, some jobs have more tasks in them that are easily automatable than others. So the larger the bubble, the larger component of a particular job is in that, in that category. So if you take the first one, it says accommodation and food services. The largest component of that job is predictable physical work. Cooking, for example, cleaning, right? It's predictable and it's physical. It also happens to be, and that's what the color red means, quite susceptible to automation, right? We have robot cleaners already, right? You could imagine a world where there is a robot cook. Not necessarily economically viable yet, but it is. You can kind of see it coming. So in accommodation and food services, it was at the right-hand side says almost 3/4 of the activities you could see would be automatable. If you now do a step back and say, okay, how many of these jobs live in WA? And so if you take the kind of job that we have in WA, and to what extent that particular type of job is automatable, it gets quite complicated, but in the end, it's something like 40 to 50% of the activities that we do in WA are technically automatable. So you would need to consider the possibility that they will be, to some extent, automated. So that then means that about 40 to 50% of the jobs will be significantly impacted by automation. It also has a positive side, of course, because things need to be programmed, robots or software stuff needs to be developed. So there's a lot of new class of job that is also happening. But just to give you a simple example, if you have a tractor that's currently being driven by a farmer, and you then think, well, it could be foreseeable that the tractor will drive itself. Now somebody needs to develop a self-driving tractor, needs to maintain it, needs to code it. But that person doesn't necessarily live in the same community as the farmer does, right? So if you're not careful, you end up with a situation that on a WA level or Australia level or global level, the total number of jobs are the same, because the farmer, the tractor driver disappears, but there's a software programmer that appears, but they might not be in the same place. And that then creates, of course, the questions for all of us. Say, okay, how can we make sure that not on a global level, but on a WA level, and preferably even on a regional level, the positive and the negative impacts of these kind of job shifts even each other out at the very least. At risk of throwing you even more into confusion with another lens of looking at the same kind of what's the question, i.e. what's a job, it's tradable versus non-tradable. And as we said earlier, tradable jobs are pretty much, again in my simplistic way of talking about it, it's jobs that are competing on an international stage, right? So, for example, a primary school teacher is not competing with a primary school teacher in China, right? But if you're exporting, then certainly your job is actually competing to whoever you're competing with. And generally speaking, this is over large numbers, tradable jobs, as was said by the previous speaker, tend to be higher paid. Now, if you take the current projections, what's happening is that the percentage of tradable jobs in WA is declining. So the total number of jobs is growing. As I said, 200,000 jobs more, you can see where they come from, but they're primarily growing in non-tradable sectors, right? Again, there's nothing wrong with non-tradable sectors. In terms of wealth creation, it's less. So these are these are jobs like, again, education, healthcare, policing, those kind of stuff. And within those, there will be sectors that are tradable. For example, education. When you say tertiary education, certainly we're competing on a world stage. And again, this might be a fantastic cluster for WA with 5 really good universities here. But it's just a chunk of the education sector. The majority is not tradable. So let's then have a look at the clusters, right? So I think there were some very convincing examples why clusters work. So we did some work and say, okay, where are the current clusters? And this is, again, a slide which is difficult to read, but you don't need to read the detail. Let me explain the slide. You see a solid horizontal line. Everything that is above the line is growing. So it's growing. Everything below the line is shrinking in terms of number of jobs. Every single dot is a cluster. On a horizontal axis, the more you are to the right, the more clustered you are. Basically what that means, if you have more than the average number of that type of job in your particular neighborhood, you move to the right. So when you're 1, you have exactly the nation's average. So for example, hairdressers, to take the same example, you would expect that the density of hairdressers is roughly equal wherever you go in the country, right? A certain number of people need one hairdresser. When you would go to a place like Newman, you would expect to have an above average mining presence, right? Or Henderson, above average marine. So those are all those bubbles. Now you see 2 things. You see that most of the bubbles live on the left side, right? Which means not very concentrated, i.e. not a real geographical cluster, right? The second thing is that the ones that are onto the right live below the bubble, i.e. they're shrinking. So for example, the one that's on the most right, the one on the bottom right, that's outback mining, right? So this is the Newmans, the Tom Price, basically the Pilbara for you. Big, certainly a cluster, but in the last couple of years, this is the last 10 years, has been shrinking. So clusters are certainly a fantastic way of spurring growth. I think the starting point that we are at the moment, given the contraction that we've had in most of the commodity prices, is a little challenging, right? So there are at the moment not great clusters that are growing yet, right? So that means that for WA, one of the challenges that we would have is we would love to lift everything up, i.e. growing, and we want to move things to the right? And that will take some effort, because as everybody can see, the top right hand of this chart is where you would want to live, as in most charts, the top right tend to be the place where you want to be. It's pretty empty. Well, so what now, right? So we know the answer. The answer is clusters. We know the question, which is how do we create in WA which is very prosperous and that increases so that continues to offer high-paying, satisfying jobs for a much larger population, despite the fact that their starting point is already a little challenging, and a new disruption in terms of automation is going to hit us, right? So you're not the first region that goes through it, and again, the previous speaker has mentioned many different regions and countries across the world. So generally, what happens, right? So it's not something that a single entity can do. Not industry alone, not government alone, not education alone, not civil society alone. It's all together. Then it's important to become very specific and granular, right? There's no point in talking about clusters. There's also no point about talking about WA, because Kununurra is really quite different from Bunbury, right? So whatever works for Bunbury is not going to work for Kununurra, right? So again, it doesn't really make too much sense to talk about WA as a whole. You need to be pretty granular and specific. And it's very easy to get stuck in kind of motherhood and apple pie things like industry and education need to collaborate. Yes, but very specifically and how specific. So I love the example about Albany and the high-tech sector, where there's a very specific university with a specific department and a specific city. That's good. But we need, I think, 200 of those examples. And then develop a joint agenda for action. And then implementation. As previous speaker said, it's not easy, and it takes, I think you said 10 years, right? So that's the kind of, so it's more than one election cycle, right? It's more than one CEO cycle. It's more than, well, maybe less on university. But it needs some longevity. Now, you're not alone. So many have done this, and just New South Wales have done a similar kind of effort and published it last year, called Jobs for WA. Ohio, just to give you a US example, has done something very similar. London has done it, and there's many, many more. And the approach is always the same. The outcome is very different. And again, the approach is a multidisciplinary, careful, detailed approach, and then an action agenda for multiple years to see it through. The ingredients of the answer are also pretty similar. I can already tell you, if WA decides to do this, you're going to end up with an answer that looks like this, because this is motherhood and apple pie, but what's below here is going to be very WA specific. So you're going to go say, what are our growth sectors, right? You're going to say, how can we make people participate, right? A healthy society, and go back to Kununurra, for example, labor participation in Kununurra isn't great, right? And you would aspire it to be higher. Partly that has to do with jobs, but also with other elements. So there is something about making sure that those who want to participate have exciting opportunities to participate. Skills, right? The coder is a very different person from the person driving the truck or the tractor, right? And there is some great stuff in WA already happening. Help them scale, right? So I'm pretty sure the answer is going to look something like this. But again, this is not nearly actionable enough. It's 2 or 3 levels of detail below here that you're going to need to make it actionable. Let me leave you with this. Again, if you want to see the details you couldn't read in the back, feel free to ask them to reach out.